Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we're listening to Secrets of the Morgue, and this is Intent to Kill.
In a murder case, best witness for the state is death.
We just don't know exactly what the cause of death was.
We did not recover a significant portion of the body.
If someone has no dental work, it is certainly more challenging to identify them.
The trauma to the skull was at or near the time of death. There was no indication of any healing on those bones.
What I find sad about this whole thing is kids not having a mother.
He was trying to say it was an accident.
We know he lied, covered up the disappearance.
This case has been called the talking skull case.
Every murder is a mystery. But a victim's body is a sea of evidence. Every fiber is a clue. Every wound, a piece of the puzzle. The medical examiner holds the key to unlock their stories and catch a killer. This is Secrets of the Morgue. 60 miles south of St. Louis, on the edge of the Ozark Mountains, the town of Farmington, Missouri is surrounded by 9 state parks.
The whole general area is rural farming and wooded areas. It's basically a bedroom community. A bulk of the people who live in that area are employed either by industry or in the St. Louis metro area. There's crime everywhere in Missouri, but Farmington would be a relatively crime-free area.
Deep in the woods near this small, quiet community, a park ranger receives a disturbing report.
We get a call that remains of a body have been discovered on the Boy Scout camp. It is a wooded and grassed area. There's not trails where you would actually be walking down a prepared trail. You got to get off the road and out through the woods to find the location.
Detective William Conway's been a policeman for 40 years, but he's never encountered anything like this before.
It is a bleached white object on top of the ground in the grass. When you got close enough to it, you could tell it was a skull. It wasn't deformed. It wasn't cracked or broken. It was an intact skull.
You've got a skull. You don't know how long it's been there, who it belongs to.
At first, investigators aren't sure if this is a recent crime or ancient history.
You have to consider possibilities. Missouri is an area that there was a lot of Civil War activity. There was also a lot of Native Americans that lived in this area at one point. It did not appear to be a place that would have been a likely burial ground, but you never know. This following case is fascinating because, as frustrating as some are, there's always a good feeling at the end when you can contact a family and let them know you found their loved one and been able to solve the crime, that's been a part of their lives sometimes for years. When you get called to a body on top of the ground and there's only a skull there, you start wondering why. Normally, you find a body, you don't just find pieces of it.
It's extremely challenging when skeletal remains and just partial skeletal remains are found. At the beginning, you're starting with an absolutely blank slate. You don't know what you have in front of you.
The shallow grave may hold clues to help identify the victim.
During the initial excavation, we found some of the smaller bones and some of the smaller items. Remains of blue jeans And the biggest thing that came up that caused us to believe this was not an Indian burial or a Civil War burial was the fact that we found a plastic bag in the grave.
The bag was from Service Merchandise, which was a retail store.
We were able to determine the time that Service Merchandise bag went into production or use in 79 and then was no longer used after 1985, although there would be some residual use of that as the supplies lasted.
That gave us a perspective of how long it might have been in the ground.
It eliminated the possibilities that this was an Indian grave, Civil War grave, any old grave.
The plastic bag dates the burial to sometime in the last 9 years. Police now consider the forest a crime scene.
In order to ensure that you have recovered all the available evidence, you conduct a grid search.
The area of interest around the grave is the size of a football field. Police map it in 4-foot squares and search every inch.
The reason you need to do a grid search when you find bones, you're dealing with the elements, you're dealing with animals. Animals will move parts of the body to eat them. And you may find a set of bones in one spot and find another set of bones 150 yards away.
We recovered bones over 300-400 feet from the center of the grave.
With animal predation, you can have marks on the bones that a medical examiner will have to determine what they're from. Did they come before death or after death, and what caused them? And was it from animal predation in the post-mortem period, or was it some sort of inflicted injury at the time of death?
We did recover part of the pelvis. We did recover the skull and the lower jaw. Some teeth were missing. We did not recover a significant portion of the body.
Investigators are hopeful that the bones they do have will tell the victim's story. The remains are turned over to the morgue for analysis.
It had been in the ground for years, as far as we could tell. There was no autopsy right after the crime. So this was a monumental task.
Determining the identity of the victim is often the cornerstone of any homicide investigation. They don't know who a person may have been with when they died. They don't know who they can go and talk to gather more information. They often find themselves scratching their heads, running up against the wall.
We started initially with dental records. We started trying to compare those to missing persons.
The teeth can be very helpful, but more often than not, it's easier to rely on dental fillings. Those will often have very unique appearances and easily compared between x-rays.
We really put a lot of weight into the dental records, but the remains that we recovered did not have any dental work. There was no fillings, no crowns, nothing.
The teeth don't match the records of any missing persons in Missouri.
In a murder case, best witness for the state is death. So you have to use circumstantial evidence, and the best circumstantial evidence is scientific evidence.
Police need more help to identify the bones and turn to forensic anthropologist Nita Bittner.
The work of forensic anthropologists is tremendously important, first of all, to the families involved. If your loved one is missing or unaccounted for, there's nothing more important to you than getting that identification. I didn't intend or start out in this type of work. The idea that a person could look at bones and from that determine who they were was fascinating to me. When we get a set of remains, the first thing we do is lay them out in anatomical position. If we have multiples of certain parts, then you know you're dealing with multiple people. In this case, it appeared that we just had one single set of remains. I naturally go towards the skull, or whatever is there of the skull. A female has a rounded forehead. Males tend to slope farther back. The pelvic girdle also indicated that it was a female. An angle greater than 90 degrees where they meet indicates female. The remains that were collected included long arm bones, leg bones, and we could use those for some of the better measurements to determine what the height was, plus or minus an inch. We were looking at a female closer to 5 foot tall, about 120 pounds.
It's the first break in the investigation, but with so few bones, they still can't identify their Jane Doe. But detectives have another clue to follow: the woman's jeans found at the crime scene.
We also found what's referred to as a tack button. It's the top button on your blue jeans at the waistband. The button was identified by the lab as having the wording Texwood on it. There was a Texwood company that did manufacture clothing, but it was on their blue jeans, and none of their blue jeans were sold in the United States.
But the jeans are sold across Asia. Detectives hope that Nita Bittner can determine their Jane Doe's ethnicity.
Forensic anthropologists are trained to identify certain features associated with different races. They look at things such as the shape of eye sockets, the shape of the nasal bones. There are a series of measurements that forensic anthropologists take of the different bone structures and the different features of a skull.
Looking at the skull, there were what the average person would say high cheekbones, and the high cheekbones are merely squared off, and based on that squared off look, it would give somebody a broader face. The nasal bone was not extended out from the face very far, much more typical of somebody with Asian Native American background.
Bittner's analysis of the skull reveals another disturbing piece of information.
We always look for means to identify, but often we can find trauma. And so each bone individually gets looked at to make sure it's intact. In this case, we were a little bit surprised to discover indication of trauma on the skull. The trauma was at or near the time of death. There was no indication of any healing on those bones.
None of us recognized anything. There was nothing obvious. However, when the anthropologist determined that there was a defect in the back of the skull, that was significant, but at the time we didn't know that. We just knew there was a defect there, which would then lead you to believe that this probably wasn't a natural death.
Dumped in a shallow grave and lost for years, Jane Doe's remains uncover a chilling secret. She was murdered.
This is a huge mystery. Who is this person?
Forensic anthropologist Nita Bittner is helping Missouri detectives learn everything they can about the skeleton of a Jane Doe found buried in a forest.
There is an area in the innominates that is impacted when a woman goes through childbirth. And a groove gets formed. If they've had a C-section, you're not going to see that. This had a definite groove, indicating that the woman had at least one child, naturally.
With the new clue, police expand their search to other states and look specifically for missing mothers.
We got a response.
700 miles away, police in Eastman, Georgia are looking for Gloria Cato, a Filipino-American mother who fits the profile.
It was really looking very much like this was going to be our victim. I went to Georgia and worked with the state police down there. We did interviews of the family. We confirmed data that was from the original missing person report, looking for possible leads.
To find out if the skull belongs to Gloria Cato, Bittner assists detectives using the best facial recognition technique available in 1989.
The police, they asked for and received an image of the person in question. The next step then was to try to do a superimposition.
The photo skull superimposition method is take a picture and match it with a skull. The police asked for pictures, gave them to the anthropologist. The anthropologist tried to match that up.
In doing a photo superimposition, we try to lay a photograph of an individual on a specific skull, matching specific landmarks, the eye orbits, the nasal opening, the mouth, where the ear attaches. And if it isn't the right individual, it's very difficult to get the eyes and the nose and the mouth and the ears all to line up. We took the photograph sent to us. We take the skull and we then try to mesh the two on a monitor. You get the eyes to match, the mouth is off. You get the nose to match, and nothing else matches. It wasn't doable. They just don't fit. It was not close to a match.
Based on their superimposition of the skull and the photographs that we had, we eliminated her as our victim. It turned out it wasn't her.
But the photo superimposition test gives the anthropologist a new idea.
Facial reconstruction is a process where we take known tissue depths dependent on sex. Males and females are built a little differently and have different tissue depths. Racial background impacts the tissue depths. You then build a clay face.
A clay reconstruction is where we mount the skull or a resin reproduction of the skull, attach the mandible or lower jaw, and then work backwards, building muscle and building tissue out of clay and traditional tools and hands to create an image of what the person may have looked like in life.
The process takes weeks, but the forensics team is able to rebuild and reveal Jane Doe's face.
The reconstruction looked very realistic. You don't know for sure what the hair looked like, but the facial features were pretty solid based on the science and using the skull as a basis. We take the photographs of the reconstructed facial features, and those were put into a news article and released to the local newspapers.
With facial reconstruction, its main purpose is to get the information out and just hope that one person sees it, has some information, and shares the information with authorities. In police work, you just never know when the next lead is going to come in.
A few weeks after the photographs are released, detectives receive a tip from a local man named Carmen Cox.
We get a phone call from Carmen Cox, who recognized the reconstruction.
I pulled up a newspaper and looked through it, and I saw the photo. I'm thinking that this just looks like her. You know, it's almost got to be her. So I believe I called the number it mentioned that time.
Cox tells police he's sure it's the face of a woman he hasn't seen in years.
Her friends saw it and knew immediately it was her.
That looks like Bungie House. That closed it in.
It wasn't, this is like our friend. It was, this is our friend.
The friend is Bungie Nyhouse, a woman who has something in common with Cox's wife. Both are from Thailand.
We moved in about 1980, and my wife being Thai, she was always looking for another couple or another people to be friends with.
For 3 years, Cox and his wife got to know Bungie and her husband, Richard.
Bungie, she was very nice. We became fairly close friends. We have two boys the same age as theirs.
Cox tells police they were confused when Bunchy seemingly left her husband and kids and never looked back.
They were told the victim just left her family, went back to Thailand. They didn't think that was suspicious, but the fact that she left the United States and didn't say goodbye to their friends, that wasn't right. The explanation from her husband they didn't think was realistic.
Police ask Cox if he has a photograph of Bunchy. They want to superimpose it on the skull to prove she's their Jane Doe.
The image provided to us was going to be a problem because it wasn't a traditional heads-on photo. And she was laughing. Her head was at an angle. Her mouth was open. And our initial thought was, how are we going to make this work? So we had to find a way of keeping the skull together with the mouth open at an odd angle. The eye orbits lined up and the nasal cavity lined up. And in this case, because her mouth was open, we could even get the teeth to line up. And as unlikely as it was, as frustrating as it was to get the match, we did.
The successful superimposition convinces investigators their Jane Doe is Bunchy Nyhouse.
Once police knew that it was Bunchy Nyhouse in the grave, they go to her husband.
Richard Nyhouse may be the only person who can help solve the mystery of how his wife ended up dead in the forest.
He was very cordial, very cooperative. I told him that we were investigating some remains that had been found and that I understood that his wife had left him.
Mr. Nyhouse, he said they had a fight over she wanted a new house and she was just walking away. It's possible she could have left.
He had taken her to the airport in St. Louis, dropped her off, and he had never seen her again. I found it hard to believe that a mother would get on a plane and leave her two children and never, look back.
In the 1980s, it was much easier to vanish off the face of the earth because we didn't have debit cards and bank cards and video cameras all over the place. Your driver's license was a piece of paper, not an electronic card.
To check Richard's story, detectives ask Interpol for any records to confirm Bunchy left the country.
Interpol is a worldwide organization to which police services are members of. So when you are looking for somebody who has gone missing, if you think your victim is from another country, then you go to Interpol.
We started looking into her history and started looking for her immigration files after, I think, March of 1983. We couldn't find anything that she had left the country, arrived anywhere else.
More disturbing facts surface when they look deeper into Richard and Bunchy's marriage.
They had a very contentious relationship. There was a lot of arguments.
In over 50% of the cases involving women who are murdered, the romantic partner is the person who is behind it.
Ultimately, after she had left him, he didn't know where, he hadn't heard from her. He took her off of his insurance, divorced her in absence, and he never ever reported her missing to the police.
Investigators are trying to solve the mystery of how a young mother ended up dead and buried in a Missouri forest. They've learned that the victim, Bunchy Nyhouse, was born in Thailand and came to America with her brother.
We tried to run the guy down, the brother, to find him. The last sighting was in Alaska, and we sent the Alaska Highway Patrol to look for him.
Bunchy's brother tells police he hasn't seen his sister in over 6 years, but he has been in touch with her husband, Richard.
It turns out that the brother had sent money to Bunchy to keep for him. When Bunchy disappeared, he started looking for his money back. He had contacted Richard. At that point, he was told that Bunchy left him and went back to Thailand.
Bunchy's brother tells police that Richard eventually repaid him.
We were able to find a check to her brother. I believe Mr. Nyhouse made a $5,000 payment.
Investigators wonder why Richard would pay off the brother after the divorce. Suspicious of his story that Bunchy walked away from their marriage, police put Richard under surveillance to learn more about his life.
His kids were in Boy Scouts. We pulled the Boy Scout records, and sure enough, he's listed as a Scout leader in the troop.
The connection is alarming. Bunchy's body was recovered in the same area Richard went with the Scouts and his children. Even after she went missing,
we learned that he was taking vacation time to go to the Boy Scout camp where his wife's remains were recovered.
What are the odds of this happening?
Detectives plan to confront Richard at the crime scene with what they know about Bunchy's death.
We waited till he got down to the Boy Scout camp with his kids. We thought it would be to our psychological advantage if he was approached right where her remains were found.
Even when police don't have a lot of physical evidence, the interrogation is another way that they can gain that evidence and learn how or why a person committed a crime. Some of the things they use include the power of suggestion. They make the person feel as if they have an overwhelming amount of evidence that proves their guilt. They have no other option but to confess to what they've done.
We hope that because he was there, it was going to be very hard for him to deny the fact that he knew the area. It would be difficult for him to explain away the fact that she was found right in the same area where he was currently at. So that was to our advantage.
They catch Richard off guard and lay out their case. They know Bunchy never left America, and they've identified her remains found right where he is standing.
We just said, that just doesn't make sense. We don't believe it, and we think maybe something happened. He admitted at that point that, he had caused her death.
Nyhouse was admitting that was his wife in the grave, but he was trying to say it was an accident.
At their office, Richard tells police his version of how Bunchy died.
We got our video camera and asked him if he would make a recorded statement, which he agreed to. It's very much us business. There's some remorse, but there's no crying, there's no sobbing. It's just a matter of fact. Here's what happened.
When I got into the argument, he got one more advantage. After the one where he got violent, started scratching my face, pushed her back, down the basement, a field support on the basement, air time. She got back in that died.
One of the most common tactics used by a suspect when they're being interviewed by the police after a murder is self-defense. Most investigators are very alive to this tactic.
Okay, it's not my way to do that. But not that why I thought everybody up there. When you learn that you never believe with
Despite Richard's confession, investigators don't believe Bunchy's death was simply an accident.
Once Mr. Nyhouse said, "That's my wife," and I pushed her down, she died, and I buried her in the woods. You got to think if it was just an accident, call a hospital. tell her relatives, tell her friends that what happened. And then you had to believe, because of that story, that it was more than that.
People make partial confessions all the time. They omit different details that implicate them as the person who came up with the idea to kill a person. Sometimes an offender will say that they actually did it, but then they'll also withhold other information. This is a way to mitigate their responsibility in the killing.
To uncover what really happened to Bunchy, detectives bring in top forensic pathologist Dr. Mary Case.
Mary Case, as far as I'm concerned, she's the best medical examiner I've ever seen. She's that good.
Initially, I wanted to be a doctor. When I was in college, I worked in the pathology department at the University of Missouri, where I was going to school, and discovered pathology. It's the puzzles that keeps me interested.
Dr. Case examines the trauma to the back of the skull for clues to the cause of death.
When Bunchy fell, according to Mr. Niehaus, she hit the back of her head on the corner at the base of that support. I x-rayed it, and I could see there was a fracture, and it was kind of at the back of the head. It's in the parietal bone on the left, but it's not all the way at the back. I took off the top, the cap of the skull, and on the internal component, you can see a much bigger fractured piece that's been pushed in. Mr. Niehaus said she fell down and hit her head and died. The injury that we have to the skull is not consistent with that story. And response to that story is that is not a true story.
Dr. Case has caught Richard Niehaus in a lie.
So why do you lie if you're coming clean and you're saying it's an accident? And why would you marry her in the middle of a Boy Scout camp if it wasn't homicide?
Investigators believe that Richard Niehaus killed his wife Bunchy in cold blood, but they need to prove it.
To me, it was pre-mortem that he had to hit her in the head to finish her off, which makes it a much more horrible crime.
Armed with a warrant, detectives searched the Niehaus basement for evidence of how Bunchy really died.
The basement was as he described it. The support pillar was there, but there was a steel support post set on top of, I believe, a brick, and it had a square metal base, which was consistent with what he had told us about her falling and hitting her head on that metal base. Off to the side in the basement was a little storage area. There was a chest-type freezer there. He said he buried her with a shovel. We were able to find a similar shovel.
The crime scene matches the details in Richard's story, but detectives know he's been weaving lies for years.
We know he lied, and he told her friends that she had disappeared in an attempt to cover up the disappearance.
I mean, it's the biggest lie of all. My wife got on a plane and never saw her again.
Detectives turn up the heat and order a polygraph test.
There are a number of psychological techniques that an investigator can use when they're conducting a polygraph test. You need to know who you're talking to, you need to know their background, and you need to know their weaknesses, their psychological weaknesses, and you attack those during the course of an interview.
The goal was to determine, was it in fact an accident, or had he intentionally killed her? They set up the questions. The polygraph examiner determined that there was deception indicated on the charts.
After several hours, Richard's story changes again.
Steel bolt in the basement. Bleeding her head.
He claims after he knocked her down, she was bleeding and she was yelling she was going to call the police. She was going to take the kids. They were going to go back to Thailand. He would never see them again.
Breakups can often be triggers, and it can send somebody into a blind rage that they then exercise on the person who did it to them.
I was scared to know when he did that, and basically I was trying to shut her up. So, my hand over her mouth and nose, suffocated.
He checked to make sure she had no heartbeat. He put the service merchandise bag over her head because of the blood. Then he buried the body.
But in his new version of events, Richard still says it was all an accident, and he panicked to cover it up.
I lost my mind.
Investigators are convinced this wasn't an accident. They return to Dr. Case to prove it.
What you can tell by looking at the skull is that there has been an impact to the head, and it's located in the left parietal region, and it has been done with some kind of object that struck with a somewhat, not exactly pointed, but not a flat surface. The falling down, hitting the head is not consistent with that injury to the skull.
Dr. Case studies the bone in an attempt to learn when the critical blow landed.
In postmortem fracturing, because the person is dead, the bone dries out over time. And as it dries out, it becomes more brittle. And when it breaks by various things that might happen in the environment, we tend to see linear fractures, but it does not have that wedged out bone on the inner table as the Niehaus skull had. And that kind of tells me that was ante-mortem.
Dr. Case is certain Bunchy's skull was fractured by an object before she fell down the stairs.
Dr. Case was able to say it wasn't caused by the base of a support beam. She was hit with blunt force, and this was made before she died.
But investigators still have a problem. They can't identify what Richard used to kill his wife.
We can't quite say, and he wasn't going to say.
We just don't know exactly what the cause of death was. You can find the truth in the bones and in the body to why a person has died. We don't ever guess.
It's been 3 years since investigators in Missouri identified the skeleton of Bunchy Niehaus and charged her husband Richard with murder.
When I became prosecutor, I thought you're going to fight for victims. And this was one that didn't have a voice of her own. The range of punishment for manslaughter at that time, I believe, was 10 years. And capital murder was 50 years without parole or death.
The key will be proving this was a deliberate act.
Investigators are nervous if they don't have evidence tying a suspect to the crime because they know this case might not hold up in court. Oftentimes, jurors will want to see something more concrete that links that person to the crime.
The DA works with Dr. Case to prove that Richard Niehaus planned both the murder and the cover-up.
We call it premeditated murder. Used to be in cold blood. Either killed her by hitting her over the head, or he could have strangled her too.
Forensic evidence can often be the most compelling if you can come up with a picture that makes sense and that is provable. That is often the most powerful evidence to present to a jury.
I remember Dr. Case getting up, taking the skull, and approaching the jury box, and they sort of gathered around.
If you fell and hit your head, you could get what we call a depressed skull fracture, meaning the bone is dented inward. If you can imagine kind of like a wedge from the outside. This had a wedge on the inside and a round hole on the outside. So I would say that he, in my opinion, has killed this woman. He deliberately struck her with something. What I don't know is what happened after he hit her, because I don't know the internal part in terms of the brain and the damage and what the outcome was. But then because he told another story about the suffocation, you have to wonder if he didn't combine a couple of true things. She had a hit to the head. She had some asphyxiation, both in his hand, not just accidentally.
The forensic evidence presented to the jury is indisputable. A weapon, not a fall, caused the skull fracture. Intent, not an accident, led to Bunchy's tragic death.
This case has been called the talking skull case. Bunchy Nyhouse was not alive, but she certainly was talking in the courtroom. I said, Bunchy Nyhouse is here thirsting for justice. And you're the only ones that can give it to her.
2 hours later, the jury reaches a verdict. Richard Nyhouse is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for 50 years for premeditated murder.
There's no excuse for what he did. No reason to get violent with her. You know, you have to be awful mean to do that. What I find sad about this whole thing is kids not having a mother.
In most of our cases, we were working with homicides, which means there's family left behind. In this case, there were children left behind. Not fair to them, certainly not fair to Bunchy.
Science helped to solve the mystery of what happened to her. I was able to apply knowledge about forensic neuropathology in terms of the head injury. Is it consistent with the story that was being told, what I felt was a false story?
Dr. Case's determination of the cause of the defect in the skull really changed this from being an accident to an intentional act. Without the cause of the defect in the skull, could have caused us not to solve the crime, or could have caused the jury not to come to the conclusion that they came to.
I'm proud of the fact that we helped her out and justice was served.